Hey kids, it's time for another Bible story. Let's get right to it. Part 5, God's People Grow. At last it happened. God kept his promise to Abraham and gave him a son, Isaac. God's promise of a new people was beginning to grow. And so God's promise passed on from Abraham to Isaac. When Isaac grew up, God gave him a son, Jacob. God's promise was beginning to grow, and so God's promise passed on from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. When Jacob grew up, God gave him 12 sons, and he named them Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. God's promise was beginning to grow. But while God's people were growing in number, they were also growing apart. Jacob's many sons hated their younger brother Joseph. They did an evil thing. They put him in a pit and then sold him to be a slave in a faraway place. Isn't that sad? Do you think Joseph was all alone in faraway Egypt? No, he was not alone. God was with Joseph, and God was going to use this evil thing that happened to Joseph for good. God showed Joseph that in a few years there wouldn't be enough food for all the hungry people in the land. Joseph believed God. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, believed Joseph. He put Joseph in charge of the kingdom, and Joseph helped him by storing up food. Then came the time of trouble, just as God had said. People came from distant lands to buy the stored food. They were hungry and about to die. When Joseph's father Jacob heard that there was food in Egypt, he told his sons to go and buy some. So they went. And Joseph, now a very powerful man, recognized them. But his brothers did not recognize Joseph. After all these years, Joseph could have gotten even with them. Joseph could have sold them as slaves. Joseph could have killed them. But instead, Joseph gave them food. Joseph forgave them. He told them not to worry. He told them God had been with him in Egypt. He told them God had sent him ahead to Egypt so that God's people would not die. Soon, Jacob's family would begin to grow in Egypt. Part 6, God's people become great. Jacob moved his growing household to Egypt. Bags were packed, camels and donkeys were loaded with things, and everyone started out. First came Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. Next came Jacob's sons, and then came all their families. 70 people moved to Egypt. By now, God's promise of a great people was really growing. And God's promise kept growing long after Jacob and his sons died. After 400 years in Egypt, God's people had grown into a great nation named Israel. In fact, Israel had so many people that the land was filled with them. Do you think the Egyptians liked having all these people in their land? Pharaoh, the king of the land, hated the people of Israel. Pharaoh hated Israel's God, too. So he treated God's people like slaves. He made them work. He was so evil that he even killed some of God's people. God's people were in trouble. They cried out to God for help, and God heard them. Do you see the little baby boy? He was God's answer to the people's cry for help. His name was Moses, and one day he would rescue God's people. When Moses grew up, God spoke to him. Moses listened to God, and then Moses did what God told him to do. He went to Pharaoh and said God's words, "Let my people go." But the king said no. He did not listen to God. Moses told Pharaoh that if he disobeyed God's word, terrible things would happen to the Egyptians. Did that make the king decide to listen to God? No. Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the river turn to blood. The entire land swarmed with frogs, and dust turned into gnats. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the houses full of flies. The animals of Egypt got sick and died, and the people got painful sores. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made hail fall from the sky, locusts covered the ground, and darkness spread out over the land. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. Can you imagine what it would take for Pharaoh to let God's people go?